Sir, this is a restricted federal courtroom. You need to leave immediately. Court Officer Martinez approached the Palestinian man with his hand on his weapon. What happened next would shut down the entire federal courthouse and launch a Department of Justice investigation. Chief Prosecutor Ameen Rashid sat quietly in the back row of Courtroom 7, observing the pre-trial motions for the most significant terrorism case of his 15-year career. He had arrived early, dressed in civilian clothes instead of his usual courtroom attire, wanting to gauge the atmosphere and jury pool without the formal trappings of his prosecutorial role. But Court Officer Martinez saw something entirely different. A Middle Eastern man in casual dress, sitting alone in a high-security federal terrorism trial, clearly where he didn't belong. "I said you need to leave," Martinez repeated, his voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. His hand remained positioned on his service weapon, a calculated intimidation tactic that had worked countless times before. Ameen looked up from his legal notes with calm dark eyes. At 43 he had prosecuted hundreds of cases, sent dozens of criminals to prison, and earned the respect of colleagues and judges throughout the federal district. But today, sitting in civilian clothes in his own courtroom, he was just another suspicious Arab to be removed. "I have authorization to be here," Ameen said quietly, his slight Palestinian accent immediately triggering additional suspicion from Martinez. Authorization from who? Hamas. Martinez's racist joke drew nervous chuckles from several court personnel, who had gathered to watch what they assumed would be the removal of a security threat. Bailiff Thompson emerged from the judge's chambers, his 25 years of federal court experience telling him that Middle Eastern men in terrorism trials meant one thing: trouble. "What's the situation, Martinez?" Thompson demanded, his eyes fixed on Ameen with undisguised hostility. Unidentified individual refusing to leave the restricted gallery. Claims he has authorization but won't provide credentials, Martinez reported, following protocol that had been drilled into every court officer since 9/11. Defense attorney Sarah Chen, representing the accused terrorist, looked up from her case files with interest. She had been hoping for exactly this kind of prosecutorial misconduct that could derail the government's case. "Your Honor," Chen called to Judge Harrison, who had just taken the bench. "The prosecution appears to be planting undercover agents in the gallery to intimidate potential witnesses." Judge Patricia Harrison, a stern woman with 30 years on the federal bench, looked toward the disturbance in her courtroom. She saw exactly what everyone else saw: a Middle Eastern man being confronted by court security during a terrorism trial. "Bailiff Thompson," Judge Harrison said sharply, "please remove the unauthorized individual immediately. This court will not tolerate any attempts at witness intimidation." Ameen reached slowly into his jacket pocket, every movement carefully measured to avoid escalating the situation. The surrounding court officers tensed, several more hands moving toward weapons. "I'm retrieving my identification," Ameen said clearly, but Thompson was already signaling for additional security. "We have a potential security breach in Courtroom 7. Thompson spoke into his radio. Middle Eastern male, approximately 40, civilian dress, refusing to comply with judicial orders. The response was immediate. "Copy. Federal Marshals. En route. Secure the individual." Assistant U.S. Attorney James Walsh burst through the courtroom doors with 2 federal marshals, his face flushed with the adrenaline of a terrorism-related security incident. Walsh had been Ameen's deputy for 3 years, but in civilian clothes and from across the courtroom, he failed to recognize his own boss. "Marshals, secure that individual immediately," Walsh ordered, pointing directly at Ameen. "We cannot allow terrorist sympathizers to disrupt federal proceedings." The irony was devastating. Walsh was ordering the arrest of the very prosecutor whose case he was supposed to be supporting. U.S. Marshal Davis approached with zip-tie restraints, his training focused on rapid neutralization of courthouse threats. "Sir, stand up slowly and place your hands behind your back." Ameen remained seated, his legal mind calculating the best approach to a situation that was spiraling beyond reason. "Marshal Davis, I suggest you contact the U.S. Attorney's Office before proceeding." "The U.S. Attorney's Office?" Walsh laughed mockingly from across the courtroom. "What, you have connections to federal law enforcement? Let me guess you're going to claim you work for the Justice Department?" The suggestion drew more laughter from court personnel. The idea that this suspicious Middle Eastern man could be connected to federal prosecution was absurd to everyone present. But court reporter Lisa Chang, positioned perfectly to observe the entire scene, noticed something others missed. The man's bearing, his legal vocabulary, his calm demeanor under pressure, something felt familiar about him. Judge Harrison's patience was exhausted. "Marshal Davis, remove this individual immediately. I will not have my courtroom turned into a circus." As Davis reached for his restraints, Ameen's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID was visible to several nearby people. "DOJ Attorney General's office. Hands where we can see them," Martinez shouted as Ameen glanced at his phone. "Don't reach for anything. It's a phone call from the Department of Justice," Ameen said patiently, "which you might want me to answer." Thompson rolled his eyes. Of course it is. Probably your handler giving you instructions in Arabic. The racial slur hit like a physical blow, but Ameen's expression never changed. He had faced actual terrorists in court, had death threats made against his family, and had prosecuted cases that made international headlines. He wouldn't be rattled by ignorant comments from court officers. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. This time, several people could see the caller ID clearly. Deputy Attorney General Rebecca Martinez. Court reporter Chang's eyes widened with recognition. She had transcribed hundreds of federal cases, and she suddenly realized why the man seemed familiar. She had seen him prosecute some of the biggest terrorism cases in the district's history. Wait, Chang said quietly, but her voice was drowned out by the escalating confrontation. Marshal Davis was now standing directly over Ameen, with restraints ready. Sir, you're under arrest for disrupting federal court proceedings and trespassing on restricted federal property. Marshal Ameen said, his voice carrying a tone that made several people unconsciously straighten up. I am Chief Prosecutor Ameen Rashid. I am scheduled to present opening arguments in this case in approximately 20 minutes. The words hit the courtroom like a thunderbolt. Chief Prosecutor Ameen Rashid. The name was legendary in federal court circles, the prosecutor with the highest conviction rate in terrorism cases. The man who had put away more dangerous criminals than any other federal attorney in the district. But Walsh, committed to his narrative, wasn't backing down. That's impossible. Chief Prosecutor Rashid wouldn't be sitting in civilian clothes in the gallery. You're obviously lying. Judge Harrison, however, was beginning to feel the first stirrings of doubt. She had worked with Ameen Rashid on dozens of cases over the years, but she had never seen him in casual clothes, never seen him without his characteristic prosecutor's bearing. Bailiff Thompson, she said carefully, perhaps we should verify this individual's claims before proceeding with arrest. But Thompson was convinced he was dealing with a sophisticated con artist. Your Honor, terrorists are trained to impersonate law enforcement. This is clearly an attempt to disrupt proceedings. Ameen's phone rang again. This time he answered it without asking permission, activating the speaker so his voice would carry clearly through the silent courtroom. This is Ameen Rashid. The voice that responded was crisp, professional, and immediately recognizable to anyone who followed federal law enforcement. Ameen, this is Deputy Attorney General Martinez. We've been monitoring reports of a security incident in your courtroom. Are you safe? The silence in courtroom 7 was absolute. Deputy Attorney General Rebecca Martinez was calling the man they were about to arrest, asking about his safety. I'm physically safe, ma'am, Ameen replied calmly, though I'm currently being threatened with arrest by court security who believe I'm a terrorist infiltrator. The confession sent shockwaves through the courtroom. Cell phones appeared as court personnel began recording what they suddenly realized might be the biggest judicial scandal in federal court history. Chief Prosecutor Rashid Martinez's voice continued through the speaker. Are you telling me that federal court officers are attempting to arrest you in your own courtroom? That is correct, ma'am. Walsh's face went completely white. The man he had been about to have arrested was indeed his boss, the chief prosecutor, the man who controlled his career and had mentored him for 3 years. Judge Harrison stood up behind her bench, her judicial robes suddenly feeling heavier as the magnitude of the situation became clear. Chief Prosecutor Rashid, we had no idea you were... Had no idea I was, what? Your Honor? Ameen's voice was quiet but carried across the entire courtroom. Had no idea I was the prosecutor on this case. Had no idea I belonged in my own courtroom. Or had no idea that a Palestinian-American could serve at the highest levels of federal law enforcement. The questions hung in the courtroom air like accusations. Deputy Attorney General Martinez's voice came through the phone again. Sharp with authority. I want every officer involved in this incident to identify themselves immediately. This is now a formal Department of Justice investigation into civil rights violations in federal court. Marshal Davis slowly backed away from Ameen, his restraints forgotten. Court Officer Martinez removed his hand from his weapon. Bailiff Thompson looked like he might collapse under the weight of his mistake. But the damage was far beyond individual embarrassment. Live streams had begun appearing on social media as court personnel shared what they were witnessing. #Courtroom racism began trending as thousands of viewers watched federal law enforcement officers realize they had racially profiled their own chief prosecutor. Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh, Martinez's voice continued. Please explain to me how you failed to recognize your own supervisor. Walsh couldn't answer because there was no acceptable answer. He had worked directly under Ameen Rashid for 3 years, had sat in dozens of meetings with him, had collaborated on major cases. But seeing him in civilian clothes in a courtroom setting had triggered assumptions based purely on ethnicity and appearance. Court reporter Chang finally found her voice. Your Honor, I've been transcribing Chief Prosecutor Rashid's cases for over 5 years. I should have recognized him immediately. Her admission highlighted the collective failure. Multiple court personnel who had worked with Ameen professionally had failed to recognize Him because their unconscious biases overrode their professional experience. Defense attorney Chen watched the proceedings with amazement. The prosecution's case was imploding not because of her legal arguments, but because of the prosecutor being racially profiled by his own colleagues. Chief Prosecutor Rashid, Judge Harrison said formally, "On behalf of this court, I offer our most sincere apologies. This should never have happened in any courtroom, least of all a federal one." But Ameen wasn't interested in apologies. He stood up, his bearing now unmistakably that of a senior federal prosecutor, and addressed not just the courtroom but the thousands watching online. "Ladies and gentlemen, what you've witnessed today is not an isolated incident. It's a symptom of institutional bias that exists even in our highest courts of justice." His voice carried the authority of 15 years prosecuting the nation's most dangerous criminals. "I am Chief Prosecutor Ameen Rashid. I was born in Ramallah, came to America as a child, and have dedicated my career to upholding American justice. I have prosecuted terrorists, organized crime figures, and corrupt officials." The courtroom was silent except for the soft sound of phones recording his every word. "But today, in an American federal courthouse, I was treated as a terrorist because of my ethnicity and religion. Officers who have worked with me for years failed to recognize me because their assumptions based on appearance overrode their professional judgment." Assistant U.S. Attorney Walsh stepped forward, his career clearly in ruins but his humanity finally awakened. "Chief Prosecutor Rashid, there's no excuse for what happened here. I should have recognized you immediately." "Mr. Walsh," Ameen replied, "recognition isn't the issue. The issue is that you were prepared to arrest an innocent person based solely on their appearance and your assumptions about who belongs in a federal courtroom." The live streams now showed over 50,000 viewers watching as institutional racism in the federal court system was exposed and confronted in real time. Judge Harrison made a decision that would reverberate through the entire federal judiciary. This court is recessed indefinitely pending a full investigation by the Department of Justice Inspector General. All proceedings in this case are suspended until this matter is resolved. The announcement sent shockwaves through the legal community. A federal terrorism trial had been shut down because court officers racially profiled their own prosecutor. Deputy Attorney General Martinez's voice came through Ameen's phone one final time. "Chief Prosecutor Rashid, a full investigative team will arrive within the hour. Every aspect of this incident will be documented and addressed through appropriate channels." As federal investigators arrived to interview witnesses and collect evidence, the broader implications became clear. This wasn't just about one incident of discrimination, it was about systemic bias within the justice system itself. Court reporter Chang approached Ameen privately. "Sir, I want to apologize personally. I've transcribed your cases for years. I should have spoken up the moment I recognized you." "Ms. Chang," Ameen replied, "your recognition of the problem is the first step toward solving it. The question is, what will you do differently next time?" The investigation that followed exposed widespread issues of racial bias in federal court security procedures. The Rashid incident, as it became known in legal circles, led to mandatory bias training for all federal court personnel and revised security protocols that emphasized verification over assumption. Walsh was demoted and transferred to a civil division, ending his career in criminal prosecution. Martinez and Thompson faced formal disciplinary action and mandatory sensitivity training. Marshall Davis received additional training but was allowed to continue his duties. But the real change was cultural. The incident became required study in law schools as an example of how unconscious bias could undermine justice itself. Federal courts nationwide implemented new procedures to prevent similar incidents. Judge Harrison used her influence to establish the Judicial Bias Prevention Initiative, working with court administrators to address discrimination in federal courtrooms across the country. 6 months later, Ameen Rashid received the Department of Justice's highest civilian honor for his dignity in confronting institutional bias and his continued commitment to justice despite facing discrimination from his own colleagues. The terrorism case eventually proceeded with enhanced security measures not to protect against outside threats, but to ensure that court personnel treated all individuals with dignity regardless of their appearance or background. The defendant was ultimately convicted and sentenced to life in prison. But legal scholars noted that the case would be remembered less for its prosecution of terrorism than for its exposure of bias within the justice system itself. Court reporter Chang became an advocate for diversity training in federal courts, using her unique position to identify and address discriminatory practices before they escalated to crisis levels. The live streams of the incident were eventually viewed over 10 million times, sparking national conversations about bias in law enforcement and the justice system. The hashtag #JusticeForAll became associated with reform efforts across the federal court system. But perhaps the most meaningful change was personal. Young Palestinian-American law students began reaching out to Ameen, inspired by his example of dignity under pressure and his refusal to let discrimination derail his commitment to justice. The federal courthouse where the incident occurred eventually installed a plaque commemorating the importance of treating all individuals with dignity and respect, regardless of their background. It became a symbol of institutional learning and growth. And in courtrooms across America, the story of the Palestinian prosecutor who was mistaken for a terrorist became a powerful reminder that justice is only as strong as the people who administer it, and that those people must constantly examine their own biases to ensure that true justice is served for all. The case continued to influence legal education and judicial training for years to come, proving that sometimes the most important lessons about justice happen not during trials, but in the moments when the system is forced to confront its own failures and choose to do better.